welcome to this national education event on red cell immunohematology. And yes, I've been practicing that regularly. And we're going to be looking specifically at transfusion in tricky patients. This event's been organised and is hosted by the Midlands Transfusion Committee. I'm Jan Smith, I'm the Patient Management Lead at Chesterfield Hospital, and I'm Deputy Chair of the Midlands RTC. And we've also got Jo Shorthouse on the call, who is our Patient Blood Management practitioner who works for NHSBT based in Barnsley. I'll kick off first by introducing Nicci Wilkes, who's our first speaker. So Nicci is a trainee consultant clinical scientist in red cell immunohematology, working at NHSBT Birmingham. Lots of experience, 26 years of experience in her field. She has special interests in education and continuous improvement initiatives. And she's going to talk to us about rare blood group requirements for a patient with upcoming surgery. So I'll hand over to Nicci. Thank you very much.
I have got a case to talk you through that was referred to one of our RCI labs a few years ago now. So this is a case of Mr. W, and this was where there was rare blood requirement needed for upcoming surgery. So let us set the scene in the opening slides. As most of our urgent cases begin, we receive a phone call from a transfusion laboratory. So this particular phone call happened on a Thursday afternoon around about 4 p.m. The summary from the transfusion laboratory from the BMS on the phone was that they'd just been made aware of a 68-year-old patient who was going for a complicated laparoscopic cholecystectomy, which was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following Tuesday. So granted, urgent in terms of it's not needed for the next morning, but there's only a few days to sort of get a plan into place. We don't know anything else at the moment. So what's our good news? The good news is that this specific procedure actually carries a low bleeding risk. An additional good news is that when we looked in our limbs, the patient was known to the RCI laboratory historically. But what's our bad news? The patient had got previous surgical complications, so there was adding risk factors there, and there was concern from the surgeons that it may result in conversion to an open procedure, which carried a much higher bleeding risk. And then the good, the bad, and what's the ugly? There's bound to be some ugly news as well. So the ugly is that although known to RCI historically, is an anti-LU6, which was confirmed by our IBGRL lab in Bristol back in 2020. So LU6, it may be one of these that we've not necessarily heard of. This was my first acquaintance with LU6 when I was the trainee consultant on call dealing with this case. So what do we know about LU6? Let's just have a very brief refresher in terms of the Lutheran blood group system. So anti-LU6 belongs to the Lutheran blood group system. So the LU antigen is a glycoprotein which is encoded by a single gene known as the BCAM gene, which is located on chromosome 19. There's 25 antigens within the Lutheran blood group system, which are all encoded by SNPs, so single nucleotide polymorphisms or mutations. The Lutheran antigens have got adhesion properties, and they've also got functions in terms of intracellular signalling. Each SNP or each mutation encodes a single amino acid change within the glycoprotein and results in the occurrence of all these different antigens that are highlighted in the infographic on the left-hand side. So highlighted in the red circle is the LU6 antigen. So this is the antigen that our patient is lacking, which is how they've made an alloantibody to this antigen. So LU6 is caused by a substitution in terms of the amino acid serine to phenylalanine, which is at the position 275, and that results as an occurrence of a SNP, which is C824 to T. I have put the original references at the end if you want to read in more depth in terms of the genetics associated with the occurrence of this antigen. So LU6, in terms of the antibody, was first discovered and reported in 1972. And again, we've got the original reference quoted at the end. So when we come into contact with these sort of weird and wonderful, the rarer antibodies and antigens in RCI, we've got a really helpful document that I can't stress the importance of this document enough. It's called SPN 214. It's available to externally as part of the Hospitals and Science website in our RCI page. I've got this downloaded to my phone. I must refer to it at least once or twice a day. Just a really, really handy guide in terms of the significance of all of the antigens that we come into contact with, and the significance of the antibodies in terms of their clinical significance, and not in this case, because this is a reference case, it's a male patient, but risk of HDFN is also discussed here as well. So again, reference for this is quoted at the end of the talk. So back to our patient, we're talking about an antibody to a high frequency Lutheran antigen. So I've just highlighted in blue the section of this document that refers to the antibody that we are worried about for this patient. So it's that low frequency that it's not quoted in itself. So we've got anti-LUA, anti-LUB and anti-LU3 are the three that are quoted specifically. And then ours comes into this other category, other antibodies to Lutheran system antigens that are high frequency antigens. So it does say that they're not proven to be clinically significant. However, just because there isn't evidence to say something is clinically significant, it doesn't mean we can write it off and say that it isn't significant. So it could just be a lack of evidence because of how rare the antibody is. So as a precaution, it's stated within this document that we should be providing LUA neg, B neg blood for patients where there is a strong example of the antibody. So what we need to look at, we put in our good news at the beginning that this patient had already been referred to IBGRL, and there were genotyping results on file as well. So if we look at these results in unison, we look at the IBGRL report that states back in 2020, the LU6 was detected in the patient's plasma and it was reacting at moderate strength by list tube IAT. So that's our gold standard technique, is a list tube IAT technique. So what we need to do, in addition to looking at the serology, is it's really helpful to have the genotype or the phenotype on file for the patient. And then we can have a look at what else the patient is negative for, so what they can potentially make a clinically significant alloantibody to. So rather helpfully for this patient, I've highlighted in a sort of purpley colour at the bottom there, we can see what else the patient is negative for. So what IBGRL have stated in their report is that the presence of anti-big C, anti-big E and anti-big K were excluded. So they are the only other things that have been genotyped that the patient's negative for that they can potentially make alloantibodies to. But this was back in 2020, so we hadn't had any recent results on this patient. So things could have changed. The patient could have been sensitised, they could have received blood in the interim, so we don't know what's going on serologically. But what do we know about our patient? So we're told, and we can look upon our limbs and both on the hospital transfusion laboratory limbs as well, that the patient's confirmed as group O positive. Their extended RH and K phenotype is RO little r, big K negative. So they've got a pan-reactive antibody screen that was detected in the transfusion laboratory on the current sample, and it was believed that this was due to the historically known anti-LU6. So the current haemoglobin of the patient, rather healthy looking, 136 grams per litre. But on reflection, when we've looked into the extended blood group, the blood tests that have been resulted on the limbs, it's seen that the patient's haematinics have been tested and that they were iron deficient with a ferritin of 14. So there are no comorbidities known in terms of what's going on with the patient other than them needing this surgery, but it is known that the patient has had those complications previously. So we speak to the consultant haematologist, and although the procedure is low bleeding risk, there is a potential for a major bleed, which they're a little bit worried about. So we have that conversation with the hospital transfusion lab and with the consultant haematologist and with ourselves as the blood services, all have that conversation together in terms of how can we best plan in the absence of any available antigen negative blood for this patient. So what do we need to know? The MS BOSS, so the maximum surgical blood ordering schedule for this procedure for a patient with antibodies is 2 units. So that was stated in the Trust MS BOSS. That cell salvage, so one of our PBM measures, cell salvage is available at this trust and is being organised to be available for the patient's procedure on that Tuesday in a few days' time. The hospital clinical team are happy to have NFBB units thawed, so National Frozen Blood Bank units thawed for post-operative top-up only. So they are happy to go to theatre, to take that patient to theatre without having antigen-negative blood on site. But should they require any antigen-neg blood for a post-operative top-up, then that's the plan in place at the moment. And there's also, like I say, the patient was investigated by RCI and IBGRL quite a significant time ago. So there was a plan to get the patient re-investigated with a fresh sample to establish if there are no new alloantibodies present, the current strength of the LU6. So we saw the antibody reacting at moderate strength back in 2020, but had that antibody increased in strength over time, it would be helpful to know the current picture. And also to perform a 2-unit cross match that was going to be ABO, D, RH and K matched for the patient. Concurrently, we also decided it would be a good plan to run some national searches for any liquid stocks if we did drop lucky and have a liquid unit available. And also in terms of the NFBB stock, so liaising heavily with the guys over in Liverpool at the NFBB lab, just to see what they've got in terms of stocks that are LU A neg, B neg, but also taking into account the patient's ABOD and RH and K group as well. So back to our serology. Sorry, I can't see the panel on the screen. Okay, so back to our serology. So what can we see? We've got, this is our frontline panel that we use in the RCI laboratory. How it's come out, it looks a little bit, hopefully you can see that clearly on the screen. So what we can see down the right-hand side is full panel results, which all 3 pluses. So we've got this pan-reactive panel, which is highlighted in green there. So no variation in terms of strength across the cells 1 to 10, all reacting at a 3+ strength. But what we can see is a negative auto control. So that's showing that with the patient's red cells and plasma, that's a negative reaction. We can also see what's not highlighted at the bottom, but we've got a valid control, which provides reassurance in terms of our panel's validity. So when we have a panel like that that's pan-reactive in strength, whether it's known serology or unknown serology, if we have a pan-reactive panel with a negative auto, then what we've got at our disposal in RCI is a panel made up of rare cells. So this is really helpful, and obviously we can gear this panel towards our patient because we know what their known historical antibody is. So as we can see from this panel, we've got rather helpfully 1 negative reaction, which may not seem a lot in a sea of positive reactions, but it does concur with what we know about the patient's serology historically, that the patient would be negative with an LU A neg, B neg cell, which we negative reaction there. So while I completely agree that lots of positive reactions aren't necessarily helpful in terms of exclusions, what we can do is go across and see if there's anything that the profile of cell 2 matches that we could potentially do exclusions to. So what else we can do, which we did do in the RCI lab, is we performed an absorption. So as we can see, we've got pan-reactivity with the native plasma. We perform alloabsorption. The gold standard that's stated in the guidelines and in the literature is to perform autoabsorption. However, there are lots of negatives in terms of performing autoabsorption. So including the need for massive amounts of patient sample. So what we tend to do in RCI especially because we have a lot of patients who are regularly transfused. We perform an alloabsorption. So we have a set of cells that are sent to us from our reagents lab in Liverpool. I've popped the profile of the cells at the bottom of the slide here. And what we do is perform serial absorptions using the patient's plasma to absorb out that antibody. So ordinarily, the main reason for doing absorption is to remove really strong autoantibodies. But what we can also helpfully use the absorption technique to do is to absorb our antibodies to high frequency as well. So each of these absorption cells will express the high frequency antigens that we are talking about in this case. So what we can see highlighted in yellow on the right hand side is when we perform when we panel out against the absorbed plasma, we can see complete negativity, which is really reassuring that it looks as though in the absence of that LU6 that's there, there aren't any other alloantibodies that are present in the absorbed plasma. So back to the stocks. Whilst we were investigating in the RCI lab and performing all of our really, really great tests to help us offer reassurance into going on, we were also running those national searches. So unsurprisingly, what we identified is that the liquid stocks of LUA B negs were nil. So what we did with the help and support of the rare donor team, there was a rare blood search was activated via NHSBT Birmingham, and one unit was donated and was going to be tested ready for the procedure. So with the orchestration and the clear communication between lots of different teams, RCI with hospital services, with testing, with the rare donor team, and all of the blood donation side of things as well, we can identify on our rare donor panel a suitable donor and to get that unit processed and tested, etc., ready for the patient's procedure within a few days' time. So in addition to liquid stock, we identified from our NFBB colleagues that there were 14 units that were suitable for this patient that were matching their full RH phenotype. So I've highlighted here, it might be a little bit small on your screens, but we've got 44 LUA neg B neg units in total, but incorporating everything else that we needed to match for this patient, there were 14 that were suitable. So low numbers, but we had got sufficient. And as we kind of reflect on the conversations with the surgeon and with the consultant haematologist, they were happy to just have some units thawed out if they were needed post-surgery for top-up. So as I've just said, NFBB units were not presently required. So I'm not expecting you to be able to see every word on this slide, but what I'm trying to do is highlight that once we've got confirmed serology and potentially pheno or genotype as well, samples have been referred to IBGRL, etc. If there is something rare to do with the patient, so in this case, it was an antibody to a high frequency antigen, but sometimes we have sent rare blood letters out if a patient has got a rare phenotype, for example, and we think that we may come into issues in terms of having an organised plan available for that patient, so that if the patient needs bloods at short notice, that there is a clear plan A, plan B and plan C that is set into practice with and being communicated across all of the consultants within the blood service and also across all of the channels of communication at the referring hospital. So the clinical teams and the laboratory teams are all aware. So this is just a template of the rare blood letter that was sent out. So obviously this patient's serology had already been confirmed and we'd verbally got a plan put into place for this surgical procedure, but we wanted to make sure that there was something that could be scanned into the limbs at the hospital. And like I say, when we send out one of these letters, we email it out, and some labs also still post it out as well, I think, addressed to the consultant haematologist, but copying in anybody else of relevance. So the transfusion laboratory manager, the transfusion practitioners, and for this case, it would have been the surgeon. If we're adapting for antenatal patients with rare antibodies, then we would also copy in the obstetricians. So the PBM measures prior to surgery, we touched upon some of the PBM measures in terms of the cell salvage. So I'm sure everybody is aware of what the acronym PBM means. Just got some infographic there that's really helpful for us to consider the different pillars. So it was identified that although the patient's hemoglobin was pretty stable, their ferritin levels were low. So it was decided on that day that the patient would have an IV iron infusion of Ferinject to improve their ferritin level. There would be avoidance of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and also antiplatelet medication. So it was really helpful for us to know that there were no comorbidities with this patient, so no potential impacts of stopping any of these drugs short term. There had already been confirmation of cell salvage available for the surgery dates, and also it was decided that an experienced surgeon would perform the procedure as well to further lower any risk of bleeding. This plan was communicated to the teams within the transfusion laboratory, to the clinical teams, and also keeping the NHSBT duty consultants in the loop as well. So what's our learning points from this case? I probably stressed throughout the case that heavy communication across clinical and laboratory areas, both in the blood service and at the transfusion laboratory at the referring hospital site. Communication and planning are essential for patients with rare antibodies. And it may not have seemed on the surface of things that we've got a lot of time to play with when we initially received that phone call at 4 p.m. on that Thursday, but there was sufficient time for us to be able to put some clear plans into place. Having the full patient genotype and the history of the IBGRL report was helpful. If we were starting from first principles in terms of those serological results of just a pan-reactive panel with a negative auto, we've got different testing avenues that we can explore initially, but we were definitely starting with a head start, having that historical information on file. Forward planning with PBM measures. So this was a really proactive hospital that the patient was at in terms of the PBM measures that were available, and being able to initiate that IV iron infusion straight away as well. So since this case was actually first brought about in 2020, we have got regional NHSBT MDT meetings now. So our clinical meetings, I chair the Midlands and South West one, and we've also got them for the North and the London and South East region. So in addition to all the rare blood letters, to the conversations that you can have with the duty consultant, these meetings are monthly, and we ensure that we are signposted by our RCI labs any complex cases, so with complex phenotypes or antibodies to high frequency, or even it could be just common antibodies, but multiples of antibodies that could potentially mean that blood provision may be an issue. So just stressing again, ensuring everybody involved in the patient's care is fully aware of the plan for complex patients, so keeping everybody in the loop. I think these slides are going to be made available, or a recording of such, so all of the references are quoted there that I've used, and thank you very much for listening to me. Are there any questions? I will try my best to answer. If I just stop sharing for a moment.
Thank you, Nicci. That was a really, really interesting presentation. And from my point of view, obviously I'm PBM practitioner. It was great that all those PBM initiatives were thought about, and cell salvage, etc. So that was really, really good. There is one question in the chat.
Okay, let me see.
It's from Falguni. Would the frozen blood, sorry, my screen's just gone.
Oh, I can see. Would the frozen blood be in Liverpool and transferred after thawing, or kept in local NHSBT blood banks? So we kind of start that cascade off as soon as it's anticipated that the frozen blood will be needed. Then the duty consultant on the day will authorise the thawing of that blood. That blood's thawed and then ordinarily is sent to the most local RCI lab for the RCI lab to cross-match. But I do know on occasion there are certain instances where the frozen blood has been sent directly to the transfusion laboratory. I think it all depends on sort of time constraints and things, but it was quite well orchestrated in this case. And I had actually got some sort of post-surgical information that I meant to add an extra slide on this patient. So they did receive 2 units of frozen blood a day following surgery for a top-up transfusion. But yeah, has that answered the question? Sorry, I went off on a little tangent there. But the frozen blood, it would stay in Liverpool until we've kind of got the go ahead. The authorizations are all in place. Obviously, sometimes frozen blood will be thawed out and then it will get wasted. But as we saw, that it's a really precious resource. There are some phenotypes where we may only have 1 or 2 units nationally. So wherever we can try to minimise any wastage in terms of any blood, but especially the rarer frozen units, then we try to do so. So NHSBT consultants would ordinarily be involved and authorise the thawing out of those units.
Yeah, it just says the hospitals contact the frozen blood bank directly, or should this be via local RCI consultant, Nicci?
So it would be via the local RCI consultant. So if you're just dealing from a transfusion lab perspective, if you just want to deal directly with the RCI consultant, then that would be via your local hospital services department. They'll put you in touch directly with the local consultant, with the regional consultant. However, if it's a sample that's in progress with RCI anyway, then RCI will normally do that facilitation. But that's why we're kind of all being involved in terms of the communication. It will all depend on whether it is a current referral with RCI or not. But the majority of these, whether the weird and wonderful ones and the complex serology, they are involved in the RCI lab ordinarily.
That's perfect. Thank you, Nicci. I don't think there are any more questions. I was going to ask you if he actually received some blood, and yes, he did, obviously. So
yeah, I think I need to update the slides and just have another a sort of post update slide, because then his antibody it has increased in strength since then, but he hasn't required any further surgery.
Oh, that's good. Fingers crossed.
Right.
Thank you, Nicci. I'll hand you back to Jan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nicci. That was really interesting. I think as well, I'm not a lab-based person, but I think it really highlights just how much work goes on in the background when our clinicians ask the blood, actually how much work there is to do for these complex patients. It really puts it in perspective. So yeah, really, really interesting. Thank you.